left's leading Macaulay Culkin look-alike. What an honour to do this panel with such an esteemed panel. They are actually all genuinely all excellent. So it's great to be able to talk about how we understand the right. And as you probably noticed, the right's on a bit of a authoritarian hegemonic binge, but thankfully we've got Keir Starmer to fight our corner with his courageous leadership. Oh dear. It would be funny, wouldn't it, if it wasn't so unbelievably catastrophic. So, we've got things we're talking about today. Now, at the turn of the century, it's interesting, at the turn of the 20th century, a lot of people on the left believe that universal suffrage would lead to an inevitable socialist hegemony, because obviously the vast majority of people are working class, and if all working class people have the vote, and they vote according to rational economic interests, then you would expect, in perpetuity, a government that would represent the class interests of that social majority. Now, as you probably noticed, that did not actually happen. And the Conservative Party is the most successful electoral force on the face of the earth. And it's interesting because Lord Salisbury, a former Conservative Prime Minister who opposed universal suffrage as many did, fearing the obvious social the political consequences the left had embraced, he said that mobs will not elect first-class men. And he was surprised to find that over a third of manual labourers in his time voted consistently for the Conservative Party, including, interestingly, at the time, in working-class Conservative readouts, holdouts like Liverpool, which was a big centre of working-class conservatism in Glasgow, though often for sectarian reasons. Now, as I say, in a democracy in which those of us on the left would understand the right as the political wing of capital, which is obviously a very small sliver of the overall electorate, they depend their political victory on securing a significant amount of support from those whose economic interests, one would imagine, it is not to vote for the Conservative Party. Now, as we've seen with the Conservative Party how it metamorphosises, how it constantly shifts and adapts. After World War II, they felt compelled to accept the post-war consensus, the so-called social democratic consensus, in which Labour secured more political and social power in the aftermath of World War II, partly because of the fear of revolution, and the Conservatives until the 70s accepted that consensus. Then, of course, again, metamorphosised into Thatcherism with an all-out assault on many of the gains won by the Labour movement and encapsulated in that post-war settlement. And today, after the Cameron Osborne era of high austerity with social liberalism of a very limited degree, gay rights, but also lots of racism, which can't be airbrushed out of existence, we see in Poland and Hungary a very authoritarian, racist right, which is hollowing out the substance of democracy, of liberal democracy, and many of those trends you can witness in this country as well. And there's lots of interesting things I think we'll talk about today on this panel. The age divide that's opened up. I think a very interesting fact which I often talk about myself, this age divide, which is often spoken about as though it's always been like this. Of course, the younger left wing, and then the University of Life schools them, and they become hard-nosed, and they shift to the right. When actually in 1983, Thatcher won a big lead amongst 18 to 24-year-olds. The young were very much pro-Reagan, they were one of the most pro-Reagan demographics in the United States in the mid-80s. 1968, it was older Americans who were the most anti-Vietnam War, it was young Americans who were the most pro-Vietnam War, including a majority of people who went to university at the time. So this big age divide that opened up in 2017 and 2019 in this country, in which even in 2019, after the disastrous election result, more people aged 18 to 24 voted Labour than even in 2017. So we've seen that big divide open up. And there's also things which obviously, throughout the history of British conservatism, which we'll talk about on this panel, racism, the Aliens Act of 1905, when the Tories introduced anti-migrant legislation then targeting Jewish refugees and migrants from Eastern Europe. Again, that theme continues. the backlash against the claims of minorities for justice, liberation, equality and security, often called the culture war, divide and rule, the attempt to exploit divisions in the working class, which obviously many divisions, those who are unemployed, those in full-time work, urban, rural and so on, those divisions, how they're exploited. The role of the media, the playthings, most of them in this country, of course, of corporate elites whose interest it is to defend the existing social order. And again, you can see throughout history how the media have used their position in order to fight back against attempts to redistribute wealth and power in this country. Famous example of the 1920s, for example, the Zinoviev letter, when a faked letter suggesting the Labour Party was complicit in an international revolution. Unfortunately, they weren't at the time. So there's lots of things which our brilliant panel are going to talk about. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce the panel, and they're going to each do a talk, and then I'm going to bring you all in, and then the panel are going to come back. So I'll introduce them right at the beginning. Richard Seymour, who is an absolutely fantastic writer whose stuff I read religiously, and I'm sure many of you do. And do subscribe. He's got a brilliant Patreon where he does so much brilliant work, so do support him on that. Give him a big round of applause. Gargi Bhattacharyya, who is a professor, author, and larger-than-life East London wrestler. Just a fact. Absolutely brilliant work on a whole range of issues, not least, of course, on race, and which has got an absolutely brilliant talk today, so give him a big round of applause. The brilliant scholar, sociologist, Tom Hills, who I feel very sorry for. Every time I want to talk about the media, often I just harass Tom for quotes, for information. He's one of the best experts that we possibly have on the role of the media, the structure of the media, the role that the media plays in our society. So give him a big round of applause. And last but not least, my compañero, my esteemed comrade, the brilliant, incredible Ash Sarkai. I'm not going to introduce anything. Coming out next year, which I'm very excited about, by the way, which I think she might mention, and you've all got to buy it. It's called Minority Rules, so I'm really surprised. Let's start with the brilliant Richard. Go, Richard.
Okay, so I've got 7 to 10 minutes. I've got a speech written out. I'm going to read it. It's going to start off sounding a bit boring, but then it'll get more and more depressing and doom-laden as we get through the speech. So do bear with me, okay? What does the right do? What is the right? The right looks for ways to restore hierarchy by democratic means. It is a reaction to the arrival of the masses in history, which acknowledges that the masses are not leaving history. If you listen to Tucker Carlson's reaction on Fox News to the Taliban's win in Afghanistan, he speculated that perhaps the 6th century had defeated the 21st century because the people of Afghanistan did not want gender studies symposia. They don't think their masculinity is toxic. They like the patriarchy, and some of the women like it too. And now they're getting it all back, he said, with a palpable note of longing for the 6th century. Maybe he went on, the US was defeated because what he called the neoliberal program of equal rights is a joke, grotesque, against human nature, and fails to answer our deepest human desires. So what are our deepest human desires? Presumably desires for hierarchy, the pleasures of protection and being protected, the pleasures of dominance and submission, the pleasures of knowing one's place and putting others in theirs, the pleasures of being raised above the ordinary run of humanity, even in one's subordination, of not being mediocre or worthless. These desires are unevenly distributed and unevenly valued. When Carlson says as an afterthought that some of their women like it too, he's clearly indicating a hierarchy of human worth. Some desires matter less than others, and the right wants to keep it that way. So in this struggle, the right's only conceptual invention was the concept of race. Almost everything else, including nationalism, was appropriated from liberalism or the left. The idea of race is erected as a defense against the abyss of equality. Reactionaries fear that a society without hierarchy is a mishmash, to use the term of apartheid intellectual Geoffrey Cronje, a pulpy mass of shit, an impoverishment of being. Hierarchy, they think, is the cellular, organic, and skeletal structure that prevents disintegration. Race, in this sense, keeps the idea of hierarchy alive in a democratic age. It promises those at the bottom, if they are in the white minority, a share in mastery. If it works, it elevates them spiritually. Now, it doesn't always work. Cronje was writing at a time when he feared that black and white South African workers were becoming too similar and might begin to feel too similar. The whites, as David Starkey might put it, were becoming black. Hence the need for apartheid. What do projects like apartheid achieve? W.E.B. Du Bois famously described the social and psychological wage of whiteness, but it's important to recognize that this wasn't just, money or social respect. It included something darker, the right of vicious whites to murder and mutilate for recreation. This is a story of civilization and its discontents. And Freud, writing on the eve of the Great Depression, asked why so many people seem to despise civilization. And he suggested that despite its rewards, it really asks too much of us. It forces us to control our aggression and our sexuality, which is what makes us alive, to the point where we become miserably neurotic. And so he said, if the loss is not made good economically, you can be sure of disturbances. And as a Jewish man in Europe, he knew what he was talking about. He neglected to discuss, among the sources of civilized misery, work. The single biggest source of stress, the thief of leisure and libido, and of life expectancy. And not just work, actually, importantly in this context, hierarchy. It's working for others. The Whitehall studies on workplace stress busted what once was a prevalent myth, that managers bearing the greatest responsibility were the most stressed out on their jobs. As it turned out, they were in fact relaxed, confident, in control, at home in their world. The stress and the associated physical symptoms increased the further you went down the chain. Working class people tend for this reason to have longer adrenal glands. Hierarchy is a killer. The worldly confidence and stability of the bosses is bought at the expense of years of life taken from those at the bottom. What's particularly lethal about hierarchy is that you can always fall further down the great chain of being. Now, neoliberalism, by intensifying inequality, also increased the costs of failure. It makes the downward plunge that bit steeper. As the sociologist T.H. Marshall suggested in his analysis of class resentment, we become aware of ourselves through comparison with others. We have this anxious status checking, death by 1,000 social comparisons, as the psychologist Oliver James once put it. By producing an emulous and sadistic culture of winners and losers, neoliberalism also makes the slide more toxic, more humiliating. So Carson stupidly reviled the neoliberal program as an egalitarian project. It's actually more that it's unconsciously nihilistic. Now, Jessica White's work on neoliberalism shows us that it is intensely moralistic about family values, Christianity, and Western civilization. So it's committed to certain moral hierarchies, as well as economic hierarchies. But if you think about neoliberalism, what is its big goal? It doesn't have one. It is committed to what Raymond Williams called a willed and deliberate unknown, in which the defining factor is advantage. To wean us off what neoliberalism considers tribalist and pre-modern notions of equality, it teaches us to see ourselves as competitive, risk-taking capitalists betting on the market, thus uniquely responsible for a fate that we have no control over. But it also teaches us that laudable goals like public service and freedom from want are actually the hypocritical cover stories of power maximizers and parasites. It teaches us universal competition, and therefore that anyone could stick the knife in. The air of neoliberalism is, as Adam Kotsko suggests, as thick with demons as that of the medieval and early modern age of an apocalyptic expectancy in witch hunts. Neoliberalism is generalized paranoia. Its motto could be, "They're all out to get you." And this paranoia turns lethal, turns to witch hunts, when millions risk being plunged into the abyss of social being below them. All evidence shows that the right recruits not from those at the bottom of society, but from those just a little bit above the bottom of the pile, the lower middle class, the downwardly mobile, recently affluent, which is most of the Capitol Hill rioters, and slightly better off workers. The little man of whom Wilhelm Reich wrote, enslaved, craving authority, but also rebellious. These people are terrified of the void, and the right harnesses humiliation, insecurity, misery, and existential dread to a war against white extinction, or what they call white genocide. It uses class to speak of whiteness, the white working class, who are notably not exploited, but betrayed, because their whiteness ostensibly gave them honor and respect until woke elites stole it. Reaction promises to restore that ontological dignity, to restore the dwindling wages of whiteness. So in this context, what do we say about the red baiting of the right, the anti-communism without communism? Is this just a decorous envelope for their racism? No, it isn't. It's the other way about. In rightist ideology, communism is the name of the abyss, the pulpy mass of shit. It destroys hierarchies that they think are precious to social being under the cover of democracy, republicanism, or these days, gender ideology. It reduces white humanity, as race theorist Lothrop Stoddard feared, to the level of beasts, and thus destroys civilization. The racism is not concealed by the anti-communism. Rather, the racism justifies the anti-communism. To give you an example, in Hitler's early speeches against communism, he explained to German workers why they shouldn't seize the wealth of the capitalists. He said that the workers had been seduced. The Jews, he claimed, had sold them a stupid illusion of equality. He said the workers wouldn't know what to do with this wealth, so it would all inevitably flow back to their Jewish seducers. Anti-Semitism reconciled violent anti-communism with the supposed material interests of patriotic workers. And we might think about this when people who claim to speak up for the white working class also oppose any policy that would make their lives any better. Except they do offer something, and it's not immaterial, and it is, if you're involved in it, thrilling. William Davies in the happiness industry defines the modern experience of depression as a generalized collapse of desire. We're unable to want anything. Depression is becoming one of the most pervasive illnesses in late capitalism, and the happiness industry that Davies describes offers you mindfulness training, CBT, and pills to stifle your complaints. The new right revives desire as a desire to know one's place and to secure it by destroying a neighbor, the adventure of selective decivilization. The air is thick with demons and it names them. And insofar as this is a bourgeois project, it trusts the state to pulverize these enemies. Insofar as it is incipient fascism, it raises lynch mobs to crush them. In India, anti-Muslim pogroms. In the Philippines, Duterte's death squads. In the United States, malicious hunting for Antifa. The subtlety of reaction is to understand that material interest can include more than bread. To be freed a little from the constraints of civilization, to be recognized, even if by a master, to be erotically electrified by the same master, to be permitted a certain amount of aggression by the same master, to have one's destructive energy, or death drive as Freud called it, not shamed, but socially rewarded. These satisfactions go under the heading of enjoyment, and that is a form of material interest that the right knows how to cultivate and manipulate. We ignore the question of enjoyment at our peril. We can't either run away from our own destructive energy, not when there are injustices that need to be destroyed. We can't hope to bypass the question of enjoyment by dangling economic rewards, more bread, or moralizing about civility, or cleaving to parliamentary protocol, or, scolding relatively powerless people about privilege on social media. The strategic question is how to provoke what Freud called the death drive without it turning murderous, and without it destroying the things that we value. Because the prefigurative politics of kindness that Jeremy Corbyn used to talk about is powerless without it.
Brilliant. Richard never misses. Now, Gargi's got this brilliant book recently, Empire's Endgame, and that partly explores how racial nationalist forms of thinking have proved so powerful for the right in constructing a hegemonic political coalition. So it could not be more topical. So please give a big round of applause and hear from Gargi. Oh, God, yes.
Sorry. Oh, I should just say about the wrestling thing that my employer, in our recent long-standing dispute, which is not over yet, and they've sacked some of my colleagues and they're still trying to sack me and others, has complained about the physical threats that they feel just from union reps being alive in the world, I think. So you should always go out, if you've ever seen me or any of my colleagues, and say, yeah, they look like they could beat the shit out of you. Whatever your optics might really tell you. And I'm also apologise that once again, I always feel I've done the wrong exam prep, because I'm going to talk about why I think we shouldn't be transfixed by the spectre of race when we think about the right. And I hope you'll understand why I'm saying that as I go on. And there's also already, I think, a thing about when we talk about the right, I think we're quite accustomed to thinking of the right as a street army. I made a note, a very rude note, when Richard was talking about how I wasn't interested anymore in the fantasy of the lumpen white male, that isn't how I'm interested in us thinking about the right. I'm much more interested in thinking about how the right is, I think, very, very effectively changing what political possibility is for nearly all of us, including us in this room. And let us first think about how we do our politics. And I hope I'll explain why I think that the right are getting a kind of edge on us, that they're getting in our heads too, and that kind of matters. Both the right in its hegemonic kind of state formations and in its street-kicking formations depends very deeply on a kind of anti-democratic impulse. Some of that impulse relates to the things that Richard has just spoken about the desire to feel something, the desire to be taken, the desire to be taken care of, the desire for an authority that feels like it can have a glamour and meaningfulness in your life again. And all of that, even if we kind of smirk at it, is dangerous because it speaks so very, very effectively to what people feel they want. And I think now is a moment that it's, we on the left can't anymore be kind of superior about that longing for an effective authority, because if the pandemic has done anything, it's shown how deeply that longing for someone to come and do things right, take authority, take control, is absolutely embedded in our people as well and ourselves. Not for stupid reasons, but for reasons that will still have dangerous consequences for us. Of course, for a long, long time, and still now, a dangerous racist exclusionary politics has been the most easily available language of that kind of longing for authority. Show your power by doing it to them. Show that I'm human by saying how not human they are. I'm not completely sold on the hierarchy idea, but I think the idea that someone will make you whole again by making others unwhole is a kind of continuing theme in the language and the structure of feeling of the right, because a lot of this is not even stuff you need to say. It's like you position in people in ways that they start to feel in that way. It's effective because it's got a deep historical embeddedment in our shared histories, all the things about, we are here because you were there. Britain can still rely on the appeal to a kind of almost crumbling imperial nostalgia, but little traces of it are around. I wonder for how much longer, because I'm not sure what that means for the younger generation, who don't even have the reference points of that kind of language, but still, you can just about do it. But I wonder for this moment. I can't tell whether it's better to put my glasses on and see you, or take my glasses off and see my own notes, so excuse me for that. For us, in this very dangerous moment, and I know lots of people kind of are going between here and Labour Party conference, but maybe to try and raise our political imaginations and concerns beyond the next headline, the next bit of the electoral cycle, that we're in a moment when we also need to check our own habits of centering race when we think about the right. Because once we've centered race, we know what to say, don't we? People are racist for good material reasons, because they learn to misrecognise their interests as alongside the elite, so you can exclude the racialised other. We need to unpack that kind of failure of understanding about their material conditions and their alliance with those who are excluded. That's all absolutely well-founded analysis, but it's not all that's happening. And our fixation with that particular scenario, which frankly we've so far failed to address, but at least we've been saying it to each other, which was better than saying British jobs for British workers. And I don't want to say there's no progress, but that can't be our only way of thinking about what the right does, or why it does it, or how it infects what political possibility can be for all of us. And I want to say a few things before I end about state failure. This moment of apparently willful state failure on so many fronts, I think is reaching into a collective consciousness across many different kinds of people, where you're kind of tapping into that longing for an effective authority. Even the petrol pump stuff is that. You know, you hear people on the buses. I heard some people on the train this morning saying, oh, of course, you know, it's not authoritarian to force people to do things for the public health. That's a good portmanteau for how the liberal left might be thinking about legitimate authority, isn't it? Public health, common good, save the infrastructure. The common theme through all of these are moving away from a belief in our collective ability to shape the world, either through existing democratic structures, which frankly have failed on purpose, or through any other collective subject. So just as capital is structured to be in kind of constant crisis response, we're living through a time where different kinds of almost authorities are igniting 1,000 tiny fires. The next crisis, the next thing, will there be toilet paper? Will there be Christmas? Will the trains work? Will there be water? Will the lights be on? And if anyone speaks to places where there's been a more overt battle around the infrastructure and people's access to everyday resources, you'll understand that that is a very effective way of changing people's consciousness. Without even having to say, you have the status of whiteness. It turns our everyday lives into a series of constant battles with others who are always our competitors. Because I might not hate you because you're a migrant, but when the last bag of nappies seems like it's in the supermarket, it's my baby's arse before yours. And you can see, it takes only a few days for Britain to fall into that, doesn't it? This week has been a kind of instructive lesson in that. I think COVID has unleashed these opportunities for the right. So not only those kinds of conspiracy theories that are doing all the rounds now, but also an almost unanswerable longing for an effective authority. I just don't know. I don't know how to answer that. I don't know how to respond to, again, good trade unionists who are seriously in meetings with me saying, oh, that, you know, we should hike up the borders, we should police people more strongly, we should have private security to do this, that, and the other. Because people are genuinely afraid. Genuine fear is a tasty morsel for our political enemies, isn't it? But I don't think this is the moment of Thatcherism. So I don't think our answer to that can be, let us tell a better story. I think somehow we have to understand how this kind of opening of rightist thinking, which I do think goes across what we might think of as the electoral spectrum and beyond, is embedded in our practices of life. That if you make people's lives precarious and difficult and not working in many ways, so that every day is a series of battles to get some everyday resource that you need to get through the day. You're structured into wishing that Daddy would come. When will Daddy come home and bring the shopping and put it on the table? And that leaves us all vulnerable to a politics where whoever can articulate some kind of effective authority, whether it's technocratic, whether it's nationalistic, whether it's downright popular culturist, I'm not sure that we yet have the tools of how to go forward with that. And I've ended up being more miserable than Richard, although actually I am a very, very cheerful person, and I think the answer to this is to articulate our collective desire for something else, but also to learn how to solve problems in the everyday, because we have to get the nappies to the bums. And I'm not going to speak more now. Thanks.
Brilliant, compelling stuff as ever. I love this panel. It is fantastic. We're very lucky now to have Tom Mills, who I've already introduced, but he's doing huge amounts of work recently, which I know about because I keep using it for my columns. But on the sociology of elites, some perspective about how UK elites operate and relate to right-wing politics. Please give Tom a big round of applause.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, it's great to be here in such good company, and it's really nice. I mean, if anyone knows me, I'm normally at these kind of events as like the left's BBC guy. So it's nice to be let out of my BBC box and like broaden a little bit. So thanks for having me. I am going to talk about the media a little bit, but really what I wanted to try and do was think about how we on the left should analyse the media and analyse the relationship between the media, political practice, capital, and conservatism, and think about the relationship between these things. I'm really glad we're having this panel, because I think there's a sort of tendency for us on the left to get all dreary and upset and self-flagellating about all the problems which God knows that we have with ourselves, and to sometimes lose track of thinking about the enemy. And there is a political enemy, and these people are human beings like us, and they operate in institutions, and they have objectives which they try and fulfill. They operate strategically. We need to do the same, and if we're going to do that effectively, we need to think about who these people are, what they want, and how they get it. And that's why I think this panel is really important. Now, I think it's useful, first of all, for us on the left to start with the recognition that capital and conservatism are distinct. Now, in practice, they overlap considerably, and I think particularly in this country, that's why we don't tend to think about them as such. But it's important that we see them as being distinct analytically and overlapping in practice as an actually existing set of institutions and movements, right? So capitalists can be conservatives, and they often are conservative supporters, not all of them, but the vast majority of them. And conservatives can be capitalists, right? Conservatives tend not to be capitalists, right? Or at least conservative supporters. That's what we've all been discussing so far, is that effort to reach out beyond that narrow class interest. Now, we have to remember that, so not to fall into two traps. Like, number one is not to think of everything as being the result of a ruling class or elite capitalist interests, right? And the second one, which I think is a trap which probably people at TWT aren't going to fall into so much, is thinking about the enemy as being purely a set of bigoted conservative ideas or institutions. So say like the Daily Mail, for example, this is kind of a liberal fallacy. If you're there, then hopefully we'll get you out of that point by the time we finish this panel and had a discussion. Now, we have to understand these social groups as being distinct, right, from each other, but have overlapping interests, and then that plays out through the political system and in society. So capitalists, in the narrow sense that Marx uses the term, like any elite, like any ruling class, as Owen said at the beginning, they have a minority interest in society. This is the sort of kernel of Marxist analysis, right? They have to build beyond that. They can do that in different ways. Now, the many contradictions of conservatism are basically rooted in that effort to build popular support for a minority interest. It's a structural feature of capitalism. They have to do this. They can try and do it through liberalism, through an appeal to universalist ideas, and that leads to all kinds of contradictions about what freedom means and those appeals to like universal equality. But usually the way that they do this is through the appeal to social hierarchies, as Richard laid out at the beginning. Now, this panel isn't about liberalism, but I think it's important to mention that the relationship between capitalism or capital and conservatism is kind of contingent, right? It could go in different directions. You can appeal to liberalism and you can appeal to conservatism, and you have liberal capitalists, right? But that need to represent a minority interest of a class as being universalist fundamental to capitalism, and that is what conservatism is rooted in ideologically. That's the structural feature of it. So what are the interests of capital? Well, the accumulation of more capital, right? And we can go and read Capital, and we can all swat up on that. In sort of more basic terms, making profit, right? Expanding their market share. But so capitalist interests, the capitalist ruling class, they do have a sort of structured rationality to them, right? Because they operate in market structures. And in that sense, we can think of capitalists as being a more rational ruling class. They calculate things. They have balance books, right? They read the FT. They keep their eye on the markets. They look at their investment. They do have these structured sets of interests, okay? But we can't simply expect and appeal to capitalist interests and expect them to do X, Y, or Z. These are real human beings. As Richard said earlier on, they are embodied in a very specific social context, right? They're not all seeing, they're not all knowing, they don't necessarily know what their interests are, and they're also not as homogenous as abstract class theory can sometimes make them seem, right? They're different from each other. Now, Marx called capitalists a band of warring brothers, or some sort of words to that effect. Richard would probably know the actual quote, maybe some of the other panelists might. But they have conflicting interests as well, structured by nation and industrial sector and so on. They're also very equal from each other in terms of their wealth and power, more than workers actually. So if you look at wealth differences, the closer you get to the top of that 1%, that 0.1%, and up and up and up you go, all the capitalists incredibly unequal until you get up to those billionaires, right? So they're very sort of fractured class interests, and they need to develop a collective sense of their own project. So we can think of capitalists as having a core and a periphery, if you like. At the core, you've got the financiers and the billionaires, and then you've got parochial business interests, right? And then everything in between. And then beyond that, minority class interest, right? You've got other classes I'll talk about in a minute. But the point is, they have to negotiate and articulate the set of interests through an actual existing set of institutions, and they need to mobilize their interests in politics and civil society. And they do that through a number of institutions. They do that through the Conservative Party, which is a subject of a recent book by Phil Burton-Cartledge, I'd recommend you all read, published with Verso. They do that in less public organizations. They do that in business and industrial associations. They do it through media organizations, which is like my area. They do it through public affairs consultancy, so lobbyists, that's just basically a euphemism for lobbyists, think tanks and so on. These are the infrastructures of the conservative movement and the overlaps to capitalism in this country. The point is that their interests aren't self-evident, right? They're not unchanging, and they have organizations and groups to do this, like we do. They have their own TWTs, but they don't look like this, obviously, and they don't look like us. At least I hope they don't, or I hope we don't. Now, beyond that core capitalist interest, they had to build broader coalitions. And so this is what Gramsci referred to as historic bloc, right? So beyond the capitalists themselves, you've got, sticking with Marxist categories, you've got the petty bourgeoisie, the little capitalists, right? The owners of small businesses. Then you've got the middle class people, workers, right? Supposedly part of our class. Now, these are the people in the upper structures of the class structure who share very close interests with capital. Corporate lawyers, accountants, senior corporate managers, advertisers, some of my best friends, I'm nothing against these people, public relations consultants, wealth managers. This is the natural constituency. And then, beyond that, you've got to reach out to build political support in broader political support, right? Working class support, the lower middle classes. That's where conservative ideology fits in. Now, I'm not going to linger too much on conservative ideology because the other speakers have done a good job so far, and I'm not even the last speaker, about that process of appealing to broader constituencies. But, okay, so I did want to share this. It's a very popular quote from Aaron Bevan. How can wealth persuade poverty to use its political freedom to keep wealth in power? Herein lies the whole art of conservative politics in the 20th century. Now, of course, it's not just about wealth, right? It's also about a whole set of racialized and gendered conceptions of social authority that allows them to build up this broader support. And that's been mentioned before. But this is ultimately what conservatism is about. Now, I think one important point I'd like to make, if there's a sort of takeaway from my talk, is that what we should never do on the left is attack the right based on the inconsistency and incoherence of their ideas, right? Yes, capitalist interests are sort of rational, but the political practice of defending the rule of capital and defending power more broadly, that is not a project that needs coherence. It's a reactive project, okay? It's much about neutralizing threats and making politically convenient arguments in political struggle than it is about building consent in any coherent or meaningful way, which is why they just seem so wild all the time and why they don't care about lying. There's a structural reason that conservatism is so dishonest. It's politically dishonest because it's trying to build beyond a narrow constituency and sell that as in the broader interest. So if you think about, I'm not just saying that they lie all the time, because they do. Let's think back to the 2019 election, where there was that study looking at the political advertising that found out, I don't know what it was like 83% or something like that of conservative political advertising was misleading. Labour was much, much lower, right? They have to lie in order to build this coalition, okay? They don't need to be coherent. So people need to stop attacking them for being like contradictory or hypocritical or any of these things. They don't care about that stuff. What they care about is winning, and that's what we should care about, but we should not abandon ourselves, our commitment to truth in doing so. Let's leave that to them. Now, I need to get onto the media because I'm the media guy, right? What role does the media play in this process of reaching beyond this narrow class interest and broadening it? Now, I think it's useful for us to think about the media in broader terms than just, as one system, right? Different media organizations do different things. The right has their elite media, so that's like the Spectator and the Telegraph and to some extent the Times. The current ruling clique of the Conservative Party is very networked into the Spectator and the Telegraph. There's the liberal stuff. I'm not going to talk about liberals, right? But remember, we've got the Economist, we've got the FT and that sort of thing, and then the Times is kind of in the middle. The popular press, traditionally, right, which has been a real strength of the right in this country, the Sun and the Daily Mail, perform such an important function for the right. Like, there's all these debates, right? How powerful are they? How much do they persuade people? Well, the jury was out for a while, but there was some research published by Aaron Rees and colleagues a few years ago, I think it was 2006 maybe, which looked at Sun readers, and what they found was that the switch of the Sun's loyalty in the case of the 2010 election and the 1997 election was able to deliver 7 points and 15 percentage points respectively to when they switched. Controlling for values, right? No change in political attitudes. This is very small parts of the population, right? But they do have that concrete role, right? They can swing elections. But that's a very small electoral impact. That's a very narrow measure. What the reactionary media does is they play a constant role in misrepresenting issues and particularly in smearing the left, right? They don't necessarily have to convince anybody that left-wing ideas are bad. They just need to convince people that the people who are pushing them are bad. And we saw that all the time, right? We're all going to be very familiar with that. These institutions, the Murdoch media and the Daily Mail, the reason they play this very important function isn't, by the way, just for swinging elections. That's a very narrow thing. They play a much broader role in the practice of conservatism. Why do they do that? They are organizations of the ruling class in a narrow sense. They're owned by oligarchs. These are billionaire tax avoiders. But by the nature of their market position, they have to appeal to a broad audience. That's what these businesses do. So that they're used by the Conservative Party as sort of like feelers for that process of appealing to popular reaction and building up those constituencies and those attitudes. And that's what conservatism feeds off. So it's very important function that they perform in what we might call the capital conservative like power structure, right? They help to keep the Tories in touch, to use that horrible cliche that's always used on the BBC and so on. All right, I'm just going to sort of wrap up, right? Because I feel like I've talked for quite a long time. What can we conclude from this? I think we need to be a little bit careful in terms of not thinking about a battle of ideas, right? The right doesn't think in these terms, right? They think about interests, and they think about the ideas that bind together and serve those interests in particular contexts, right? So I think the left needs to start thinking about where we're strongest, and that's probably in areas like, the appeals that we can make to the public, those sets of ideas, right? We don't have a lot of social power in our institutions at the moment. Perhaps certain trends in political demography, right? But what we really need to think about is where the enemy are weakest. And this means being attentive to their ideas and interests and the way that this sort of capital conservative coalition is structured in this country, right? I think we also need to avoid thinking about the UK or other capitalist countries as being inherently and irrevocably conservative, right? The right has to work to win, and they work hard to do that. And they have an advantage almost axiomatically by the fact that they are the people in power, right? But in order, so we're at a disadvantage. And that, I think, is why research on them and strategic thinking about how the right operate is so important. I think we need more of that. And I'm really glad to be part of this panel, which I hope is the start of a conversation and a longer process on the left.
Tom there. Now, very honoured to have our final esteemed speaker, who has a brilliant speech, which I know because I've been cheekily looking at her notes. So please give a big round of applause to Ash Sarkar.
You said that Daddy wasn't coming to save us, but Daddy's home. Gargi. Full disclosure, I'm quite hungover, so in comparison to these scintillating and sparky speakers, I feel like my brain is buffering, so please give me a bit of leeway. I want to talk today about class, culture, and culture war, because I think that it is tempting for the left to see the right's use of culture wars framing and go, what we must do, comrades, is return to a pure class politics. And what I want to argue is that, one, a pure class politics has never existed outside of culture. And two, right now, everybody is doing identity politics, including, if not especially, those who profess to disdain identity politics. Now, before I get cracking on that bit, I should probably talk about what I mean by identity politics. Because identity politics was coined by anti-capitalist black feminists, the Coambi River Collective. But it has become detached from those explicitly anti-capitalist roots. Now, more broadly, identity politics is the question of how we perceive ourselves and our communities in relation to others, and it has become the master frame through which all politics must pass in order for it to become visible. Identity politics is no longer concerned with being freed or liberated from constructed positions of vulnerability. It merely asks that those positions of vulnerability be recognized, and it has become, I think, the dominant mode through which politics is experienced in an age of intense mediatization. And so one of the things that I'm trying to understand is how is it that the Conservative Party is able to reinvent itself as the tribune of the left behind? The UK hit peak income equality in 1978. In April 2018, we reached the first inequality peak since 1913, so equality getting worse. And yet Boris Johnson has sold the Conservatives as an insurgent force, despite the party having formed governments in 18 out of the last 28 general elections. Now, we can talk about the favourable conditions of a right-leaning media. We can talk about that it is easier having oligarchic capital on your side, but I think that we need to go deeper than that. And we need to grapple with the transformations in Britain's class composition and analyse the political narratives which have emerged from those changes. So it's weird, right, that the party of capital flourishes in a context where economically we are so unequal. But I think the thing that we've got to understand is that class consciousness, how we experience our class position, how we experience our social selves, has become decoupled from wealth and wages. As Margaret Thatcher famously put it, economics are the method, the object is to change the soul, and that soul has been transformed through 40 years of neoliberalism. The power of the trade union movement was broken by the end of the miners' strike and the anti-union legislation that followed, resulting in the UK workers' strike total falling to its lowest level since 1893. Globalisation and the shift towards a service sector economy meant the decline of heavy industry in the UK, driving up regional inequalities, which of course corroded communities and resulted in a kind of dispersal. And the advent of right to buy, the collapse of council house building, did two things. One, it created a new propertied class out of former council tenants and a new landlord class. 4 out of 10 properties bought under right to buy are now buy-to-lets. But it also created a new generation of atomised and precarious private sector renters. So class obviously didn't cease to exist under neoliberalism, but the institutions which produced class consciousness, grounded in material conditions, did. And so one of the things that has happened with these, kind of bastions of left-wing consciousness being smashed to pieces is that unmoored from the gravitational giants of industrial labour, social housing and trade union militancy, class consciousness has now been allowed to float freely amongst a nebulous set of social signifiers. And so this is how we get into all this silly shit like, is feta middle class, right? Accent, proximity to manual labour, immigration status, education, race, consumer habits, geography, political and cultural disposition, and sometimes outright delusion determines who gets to claim the moral authority of speaking for the working class. And the reason why I talk about outright delusion is I'll never forget a tweet by The Guardian's northern correspondent Helen Pidd saying that you can be working class and be a property developer. Bitch, what? Like it doesn't make sense. You can be a multi-millionaire working class person as long as you've got both reactionary politics and a regional accent, right? This tells us something about the way in which social signifiers are really important in terms of how people perceive themselves and others. These social signifiers can obscure the matter of income and assets. And the reason why that's possible is because culture is tangible. Culture is where we live. Culture is how we experience the world. And so these snapshots and these totems, this hodgepodge, have become, I think, particularly loaded in recent years. And it's weird that the economics of class have somehow become more distant and abstract than what coffee somebody orders, or whether they feel comfortable around transgender people, or how they feel about Black Lives Matter. The malleability of culture means that the freelancer with a laptop, hello, is coded as privileged rather than precarious, and the retired homeowner is indeed left behind. And so we've ended up with an image of the British working class that does not include the majority of working age people, which more often than not comes attached with the prefix of white that renders invisible the army of Uber drivers and Deliveroo riders, that underpaid tribe of many nations which constitutes the British precariat. And so how do we understand political antagonism? Today, political conflict really is identitarian. It's city versus town, it's woke versus reactionary, it's culture versus culture. And I think that making sense of this, it's instructive to return to Stuart Hall, who says that politics does not reflect majorities, it constructs them. But the same is true of minorities. Politics makes the minority as well as the majority, and the minority can do lots of different things. The minority can signify threat, it can signify moral authority, it can also signify vulnerability. And so I think that one of the things that helps us make sense of what's going on is both the real and imagined forms of minority rule. There are fantasies of minority rule. The idea that people of colour are outbreeding white people. I mean, what's your attachment to whiteness? What does it mean? Why would it matter in 2060 if more people are going to be a bit browner than you? Unless it means everything, right? This fantasy about transgender people taking away your right to think about your gender in relation to biological sex. No, that's not happening. This fantasy around, kind of climate protesters who want to rob you of your car and your holiday. But also, what the minority can signify is a kind of authority status. And that's why we see the right appropriating and nicking from the language of the left. This happens when it comes to issues around free speech, but this also happens when the language of minoritized grievance is used to articulate dominant interests. There's a reason why the language of demographic apocalypse appeals to white people's fear of becoming a minority, because they know how badly minorities were treated by themselves. I think that it's important, to acknowledge what Tom said, which is that this doesn't have to be coherent, that it's deeply contradictory. What matters is that it is emotionally potent. And these paranoid fantasies about the imminent overturning of the social order have long been a part of right-wing self-mythology. Enoch Powell saying in 15 or 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white. But I think why it matters now is because it's become attached to a new authoritarian project, which is a hegemonic project, I think, in a Gramscian sense. So it's not just about legislative power, but establishing control over the cultural machine, steering political antagonism away from wealth and towards the more malleable category of those who are seen to wield illegitimate power: brown people, black people, immigrants, women, gay people, trans people, people who eat vegan sausage rolls. And I think that this deep, paranoid fantasy and the way in which it dictates politics, I think that we have an investment in it ourselves. One of the things that we try and do in order to overcome it is emphasize our decency. No, we're not wrong-uns. No, we're not weirdos. Oh no, we're not scary. We look just like you. We are you. And I think that what that does is buy into this idea that there are certain kinds of human who are inherently scary, who are inherently threatening, and they're threatening because of the way in which they wield their vulnerability. And the minute we buy into that, the idea that vulnerability is a threat, we abandon, I think, the central tenet of left-wing politics, which is that everyone is deserving of care, everyone is deserving of love, everyone is deserving of dignity. And there's the social conditions which deny people those things which are obscene. And I think I want to maybe just end it here, perhaps on a hopeful note, which is this project of paranoid fantasizing around minority rule. It is not the project of a confident right wing. It is the project of a deeply scared and anxious one. I think they're worried about what's going on in the realm of culture. The fact that that support for capitalism is collapsing amongst young people, but not just that. Support for white nationalism, for ethnic superiority, for bigotry against LGBT people is also falling. I was talking to a former conservative strategist whose name rhymes with a Schmominic Dummings, and one of the things he said is, there is a culture war and the left have won it. Now, I think that this is an oversimplification, but I think that this is why they're so focused on institutions around knowledge production, the BBC, museums, universities, what's going on social media. It's because what young people actually think, what the next generation of voters think, is that, well, maybe equality isn't so bad. Indeed, maybe it's desirable. Maybe we don't need to buy into this notion of hierarchy in the sense that what it's going to do is bring meaning to our lives. You look at the way in which demographics are changing in this country on the basis of race. And what does that tell you? It tells you that people are falling in love. It tells you that people are having families together. And this is where I am actually a bit of a liberal. I think that it becomes quite hard to maintain a sense of your own superiority when you have to share a life with somebody and raise children with them. So the right are scared. And I think they try and deal with that fear by making it our fear. And I think that the way in which we deal with it is by meeting it not with a different kind of scaremongering, but with a renewed confidence, a sense of optimism, a faith in human collective action and what it can achieve. And most of all, not to sound like a big hippie, but love. Love for one another, love for those that we are taught to hate, and love for those whose vulnerability we are taught to be afraid of because we think it signals a threat.
Wow, and I, for one, cannot wait for Ash's book. It's going to be one of the most important books of our time. Whack that on the cover, if you like.
I think it should be called Bang Your Way to Freedom. That's kind of like
Ooh, it's getting erotic. No, but her raw humanity really came through there, and I'm glad we had a bit of optimism as well. Let's try and I'm going to bring you in now, and optimism is always great. If anyone can inject that into the conversation, things are fine. So do whack your hands up, and I will call you.